Welcome to the Valued Cultures podcast. I'm Mike Merrill, a founder of Valued Cultures, and I'm here today with my co-founder, Daryl Ogden,
Hi, Mike. How are you?
as well as our guest, Jason Della Rocca.
Hey guys.
Welcome, Jason. And reading Jason's resume is like taking a world tour. I'm sure to miss something here, but here it goes anyways. After starting out at Price Waterhouse and Silicon Graphics and Matrox, Jason went on to become the global executive director of the IGDA, as well as co-chair of the Montreal chapter. He served 6 years on the advisory board of ICT, Global Affairs Canada, and then became a co-founder of Execution Labs, which was a starting point for dozens of young studios and a number of our guests on the pod, like Tanya Short of KitFox and Julian Murata of Norsefell, started out there. And he was the board chair as well of the related gameplay space. And we'll talk a bit about how those two work together. Most recently, he's been working as an ecosystem strategist, not just advising game studios on funding and product strategy, but working with governments, local, national, around the world. North America, sure, but South America, Europe, Asia, the Middle East, Africa. And we're going to hear some stories from Jason about working in all those places. Jason, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much, Michael. It's sort of always a bit scary when you read all this stuff out. It's like it reminds you how old you are.
Yeah, I was gonna say how experienced you are, but if
Experience, I think it's
if you want to focus on the age, that's your business, right?
Jason, we love to start with just how you got into games. How did you get into games?
Yeah, well, listen, most of the folks in the game industry obviously have origin stories where they grew up playing games, love games, et cetera. And so I'm no different in that regard. I mean, my first video game experience was the original Pong. Again, I'm Daryl. I'm aging myself there. Where at one of my friends' birthday parties, I think we were in kindergarten. The dad brought home the original like Pong. That you like screw to your TV set with the two paddles and stuff. And all I remember is seeing the dots move on the screen. My mind was blown, and that kind of started my video gaming adventure. I had a lot of the early consoles like the Atari 2600 and played with a Commodore 64 and VIC 12, all this kind of stuff, Amigas and all that jazz, and then obviously moving on to consoles and whatnot. So I was always a geek, a gamer, a lover of all those kinds of things, etc. Going into university, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I was good with numbers, and so I was actually studying accounting. I was oh, accountants make good money. Why not? I'll go be an accountant, and that's where Price Waterhouse, comes into the mix. That was really my first. Actually, I had an internship there, and then moved on the following year, and it was just too boring. It was too dry. I mean, basically, I just felt sick in my stomach, doing that kind of stuff. And then I ended up at Silicon Graphics, and so I kind of leveraged my geekiness, nerdiness, gamerness to kind of get it at SGI. SGI famously made a lot of the hardware and software way back in the day for some of the original VFX and CGI for things like the first Tron movie and
Right.
the Jurassic Park movies and the Abyss and this kind of stuff. So it was sort of game adjacent. Although I do remember there was a day at the office where they brought in a prototype Nintendo 64 because there was a SGI chip driving the graphics in the N64. And at that time, we were more sort of on the movie VFX side of things. But I was funny enough, like a demo jockey. I mean, I was like early 20s, whatever.
Yeah.
I was helping the salespeople. They were just sales guys. They didn't really know how the tech worked or whatever. And I was sort of like the demo jockey that at the clients and companies, I'd be like driving all the machines and things. But we were mainly focused at that time on VRML, which is the virtual reality markup language, because the internet was just starting to be a thing. The World Wide Web was just starting to be a thing, and so there was this whole movement towards VRML, so like 3D in a browser and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of funny to see those things kind of come full circle. But then I parlayed that into the gig at Matrox, which really Matrox was the start in the game industry, where now it was a developer relations / evangelist role where you're working with game developers all over the world, going to places like the Game Developers Conference and E3 at the time and other events around the world to work with game developers to help them optimize their games to run on 3D graphics chips, which, mid-late 90s was like a brand new thing. I mean, everything at that point was all software rasterized. There were no 3D chips and stuff. So it was really kind of fun to get that rolling. And, and again, got to travel the world and meet developers and work with studios all over the place. I was there probably till like early 2000. I was fired under suspicion of corporate espionage related to the original Xbox project, or the X project. There was a dispute. Yeah, well, we can't really get into that.
Wow, it sounds amazing.
Yeah, there was a dispute because NVIDIA won the deal to be the chip in the original Xbox, the NV1.
Yeah.
And there was a bit of a fight between Matrox.
Whatever happened to that company, NVIDIA?
Yeah, well, exactly. Oh my goodness. Oh my God. I watched them come from like literally nothing,
right.
And sort of fought with them in those really early days, call it late 90s or whatever. Anyway, so that was sort of the end of the Matrox days. And then before jumping to IGDA, I had a little sort of 3 months at a tech middleware company called Quasal that was doing multiplayer technology that was used in like Rock Band and a bunch of Ubisoft games and stuff like that. But I was fired from there as well. So I kept getting into fights with the CEO because he was more of a old school telecom guy, and
right.
Didn't like they hired me for my game industry connections and knowledge, but then I told them things that they didn't want to hear. And so that, rather than implement new things, they said, I'd get rid of this guy. And so I got fired again.
It sounds like when you ended up at IGDA, you'd already had some global experience then.
Correct. IGDA is, it's an interesting role to find someone who has, game industry knowledge and connections, and also sort of a care for the industry and a love for games and for game making, but also has some sense of like, governance and advocacy roles, and sort of like more of this meta kind of role that it takes. I mean, I was probably 25 at the time. Like, I didn't know any of that. I mean, I had the game industry connections, and I had been around the world a few times, and I had the respect and sort of love and passion for the industry, but I didn't know the first thing about running a nonprofit or building an association or, or anything like that. But, whatever, you pick up a few books, and, you listen to the members, and you have intuitions, and you do the best you can to improve the industry and make it a better place for developers to thrive and, make games and all that kind of stuff. But fun enough, I was threatened to be fired, 2-3 times a year from the board of directors. Like your boss, when you're the executive director, the boss is like the 15-person board. And so half of your job is like this kind of lobbying effort, politics with the board members. While they have best of intentions, it's still hard to manage all those personalities. And generally speaking, the board members of the IGDA were veteran game developers. So, legends in their own right, well-respected, knowledgeable, smart, but they also know nothing really about nonprofits, governance, all these kinds of things. And so there was often sort of friction there, even though everyone was trying to, really do well and make a difference. There was obviously, differences of opinion. The board sent me for like manners training, and they made me like books like the Dale Carnegie, like how to make friends or whatever. I was a bit too aggressive.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because it sounds like it pointed you in two directions, right? Because you were a co-chair of the local Montreal chapter, and then you had a global vision too. And I think that looks to me like that really plays out in your career, where in some ways you're bringing this incredible success of the Montreal ecosystem, in some ways, some of the lessons you've learned across the world.
I mean, the IGDA Global, my role started in, let's say, late 2000. And the following year, I said, well, geez, we might as well get a local Montreal chapter up and running. And in part, it was because I felt it was needed for the community here, or lack thereof at the time. And also then it was kind of my like test bed. So when I was trying to support, guide, set policies for other chapters around the world, I wasn't just sort of doing it from my throne or whatever. Rather, it was like I was on the ground trying to raise local sponsorship, bring in members, do events that had impact, this kind of stuff that I can kind of then, have that tangible experience to bring back to the other chapters around the world.
So Mike and I, we talked a lot about you, Jason, before we knew you, because when we were getting to know the game developers in Montreal, I worked for years with Guillaume Provost at Compulsion, and Guillaume for us was a vector to meeting a bunch of people that he had helped and mentored and, advised in a variety of ways. Call it the half generation below him, in terms of seniority, I guess. All of these people, every single person we met them over a course of a week. We had all of these meetings. Every single one of them mentioned Jason Della Rocca, Jason Della Rocca, Jason Della Rocca. And we're like, who's this Jason Della Rocca guy? We gotta find this Jason Della Rocca guy. He's the source of all of this mentorship and so on. And those people met you in the context of Execution Labs, right?
Well,
and
some
so,
of them. I mean, Guillaume, I knew from prior to that for many, many, many
yeah,
years.
that's right.
In fact, Guillaume was the founder / co-founder of the Toronto IGDA chapter because he did a sort of stint over in Toronto.
That makes sense. Yes.
Like Anya, Julian, et cetera, kind of come into the picture more at the Execution Labs time.
Yeah. And so all of these people look at you and they say, well, Jason and Execution Labs and that whole experience, that whole ferment that was created was so generative of a generation, I think, of game developers in Montreal, one of the great gaming centers in the world. And so I wonder if you could speak to that experience a little bit and what you created with other people as well.
First, thanks for that, Dal. It certainly helps my my ego, boost my ego, all kinds. I appreciate that. But
it's true too. It has the virtue of being true.
Well, thank you. So a lot of that kind of comes back to the origins of IGDA Montreal chapter, where the industry was just sort of starting to percolate. Ubisoft had been on the ground for about five, six years. EA was just kind of getting formed. You had Behavior already there for a few years. It's stuff sort of starting to happen. And yet there were no meetups, no events, no conferences, no knowledge. There was nothing. This is like 2001, late 2000, early 2001. And I said, well, geez, I'm the IGDA guy globally now. Like, if I can't somehow bring people together in my own backyard, like, what am I doing? And so I found a few other folks that were a bit more visible, and kind of we came together and started the local chapter. And it really did feel like we were like cavemen, cavewomen, kind of going to the fire and like banging our sticks. And then from the bushes and the trees, other developers like came out of their caves and like, what? There's other oh my goodness. And we all just sat by the fire and started sharing, exchanging. And that really created kind of a rich community that built, from year to year to year to year. If you're thinking of like stratas of sediment of community, like that really was the first kind of base that got laid down that then we built sort of Execution Labs in that context, as opposed to it was the middle of the desert and we just came with our Execution Labs flag or whatever. All the folks, all the volunteers, all that effort I think was meaningful. But funnily enough, after I left IGDA, so I did IGDA Global, like the official ED role, for about 9 years. I stepped down, and around that time I was getting calls from governments who were starting to recognize the economic potential of games and the value of games, game businesses, export revenue, knowledge worker jobs, high-tech jobs, all this kind of stuff. And so I started getting calls as the boss of IGDA saying, hey, can the IGDA help us, figure out our strategy or our policies, our programs to like grow this business in our land or in our region? And I said, well, you can show up to chapters, you can, come to GDC. No, like we didn't really have that as a service. Like that was sort of relevant, but kind of outside the sort of mandate, the direct mandate of the IGDA. And so when I stepped down, I said, you know what, I'm going to call back all those governments and say all of a sudden now I'm a ecosystem, consultant. And so that kind of started that process then of guiding governments, sort of building these programs. And of course, when you're thinking of kind of nurturing and catalyzing an industry, you're talking about talent pipelines and education. You're talking about new, startup funding and incubation of new IP. You're talking about accelerating and scaling businesses and mentorship program. You're talking about these kinds of things. And so I was talking a lot about that for like a year, 2 years or so, and advising governments and so on. But at that point, I had never actually ran an incubator or ran an accelerator. I had not like done it myself. And there were some investors in Montreal, Real Ventures. At the time, was one of the most active startup, early stage, general tech investors, no games at that point. And they were running a very successful tech startup accelerator called Founder Fuel. which, super successful in its own right, et cetera, et cetera. Never touched games, but, very important to the Montreal overall tech and entrepreneurship ecosystem. And they approached me and they said, well, a bit like you were saying before, Daryl, they had the idea, well, if our tech incubator or accelerator is doing so well, Montreal is such a hotbed for games. Why don't we also start a game one? And they just started talking to people. And then everyone said, oh, you got to talk to Jason. And so then they called me up and said, every time we talked about game industry, everyone said, talk to you, like what's going on? And so we chatted, and essentially the idea of execution labs came from those, like the spark anyways, came from those investors. And then they said, okay, well, come up with a model that you think, borrows Techstars and Y Combinator and the Founder Fuel and whatever, but like, reimagine it for game entrepreneurs and game startups. And, we'll see if we can come to an agreement on a model we like. And so we did. They were the first investor, and then, White Star, BDC, other investors kind of came on board. And this was 2012. First cohort started in 2013, but at that time, there was no venture capital in games. I mean, very, very, very little. I think you had Mitch Lasky doing some stuff. You had the London venture partner guys kind of doing more angel-oriented stuff with some of the early deals they did. But like all of those big Makers Fund, Griffin, Play Venture, all of those funds did not exist, at that point. It was some years later. So we were one of the first sort of venture, like invest in the studio oriented entity, and certainly the first sort of game focused accelerator, venture backed, all that stuff at the time. So that was sort of the context. And listen, I can talk about this for days and days, but one of the interesting things was, and I think this is somewhat relevant to the other parts of the conversation, we thought that there was latent entrepreneurial talent amongst all of the AAA developers. Because whenever you went to one of the IGDA meetups or any conference, everyone was always like, my boss, my producer, I wish I could be indie and do my own thing and start my own studio, I have my own idea. Like everybody is like, chit-chatting and have their own dreams and so on. So we said, well, listen, if we create this incubator and we're going to give funding and we're going to give coaching and access to, partners and all this kind of stuff, like, okay, all these guys are finally going to pull the cord or rip off the Band-Aid and they're going to come and, join our incubator. Nobody. Like no, almost nobody. Like instead, it was the scrappy, it was the recent graduates, it was the ones who were already indie. That's, oh, here's an opportunity to get some support. There were a couple of teams that came as like, oh, we just sort of quit our jobs at UB or EA or wherever and joined, and those were usually the worst teams.
Yeah,
like they just could not survive in that more entrepreneurial. It was a lesson for us in sort of understanding that who we thought were going to be the ones most eager to get going as independent, entrepreneurs, really weren't, and they just were not sort of well equipped, kind of being out in the wild versus being, on a team of 100. I mean, overall, it really was a great experience. Like even the failures were still kind of meaningful, and we learned a lot. And I think even for the developers who tried to be indie and entrepreneurs and failed, like some of those AAA folks, they're like, oh, it didn't work. We went back to AAA and now it's like, much easier, and we have a better, more holistic sense of the business, and we're, climbing the ladder much faster. So like even for the ones who failed, technically it did sort of serve as a springboard. So it's kind of, heartwarming that kind of on the whole, everyone really kind of leveled up and progressed. So that just from a, sense of accomplishment, that makes me feel good.
Is there a story from the Execution Labs experience that crystallizes the best of the experience?
I mean, obviously, Julian from Northfell really well. I mean, I remember on Tribes of Midgard, they were struggling to get funding for that. They were chasing publishers nonstop. They were going from event to event, and everyone's saying like, cool, come back later, show us more progress. And they like remortgaged the house, and they would drop their salary. I mean, they really went for it. And I remember we had a board meeting, and it's like, we have X many months to survive, and then it's over. Like, what do we do? And I remember, maybe of all of Execution Labs, like one of the most kind of critical or pivotal pieces of advice. I said, guys, when the publisher is saying come back with more progress, they don't mean they want to see 5 more swords and another giant, boss battle or whatever. what they want to see is progress in terms of player validation. They want to see that you have players in the game, that the playtest numbers, session time, like that you're getting wish lists, this kind of stuff. And I said, like, put down your keyboards, stop producing, and focus 100% on community building, run some playtests, get the game up on Steam, like all this kind of stuff. And so they were a team of 7 at the time. They hired 2 community managers. And then the following month, they ran their first playtest. I think it was with like 2,000 players. Then the next with 4,000, the next with 6,000. They did an open beta with 12,000, and then with 22,000. And then the phone started to ring, and they were getting competing bids. The rest is history. And they made a great game, and they really turned it around.
That was timely and critical advice, and also well executed. It's one thing to give advice; it's another thing for someone to execute on it fully, and all of that whole loop worked.
It's funny you say that, because I've been giving advice of this nature for a long time, and not everyone listens, or they just sort of fumble, or they think, oh, but maybe for us it'll be different, and we'll just kind of stick to our. I did a lecture once at a conference, and I kind of, I gave Northfell as an example with that whole Tribes of Midgard, whatever community focus and so on. The question from the audience was like, does this actually work? And I'm like, well, it works if you do it. If you do it, well. And of course, there's always the caveat that your game still has to be a great game. Like if your game's not good, it doesn't matter how much fancy marketing stuff. Like it's just not gonna work.
Right.
So
before I jump to the more broad world, maybe you can just tell us a little about gameplay space, because I think it's an interesting side, kind of, I don't want to say sidebar. It's more like adjacent or complementary to what was going on at Execution Labs, right?
Execution Labs was a kind of a classic, well, maybe a hybrid, because we designed it specifically for games, but kind of hybrid incubator accelerator, venture backed. We would get 1,000 pitches, we would pick 5. So you're saying no almost all the time, right? And I'm picking the best 5 and putting my bets on those 5, and then putting all the funding, mentorship, love, resources, hugs, everything to help those 5, every sort of batch, right? Every cohort. And what would happen is many of the teams who we said no to said, well, fine, don't give us the money, but can we still get some coaching? Can we still come hang out? Can we just be around? Because we need guidance. We need something. Like fine, you said no, but can we just linger? And we're like, sorry, no is no. I have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize the bets that I'm putting on the table. I can't be distracted. And as a kind of a community person, and certainly based on all the nurturing work that I did through IGDA, I kind of really felt bad that I had to say no so much. And so then we imagined having this kind of sister entity, which was Gameplay Space, set up as a nonprofit, with some government grants and sponsorships and whatever, but that entity would say yes to everyone. Oh, you want to join the work? Come, yes. Do you want to hang out? There's a desk here for you. Do you want to learn from each other? Yeah, come, yes, yeah, just yes. It was the vehicle within which we could say yes to everyone and everything. And it was a co-working space. It was kind of a platform for knowledge exchange. I mean, much like sort of banging the sticks and the cavemen and women coming out from it was like that for more entrepreneurial minded studios that would come. And this was all pre-COVID. Also, just because of the fact that Montreal is such a hub, every other week there was people from Xbox, from Steam, from Epic, from Kickstarter, from Facebook, every Tencent, every investors, press, and they would all do a pit stop at Gameplay Space to kind of see, what was going on. And they would come into one place. It was a cool space, big open, warehousey kind of space. There's 120 developers. They would see, 20 to 30 different projects. So, for example, Tanya was there with Kit Fox. Julian was there with Northfell. Outer Minds was there, and Clever Endeavor. There were so many studios. And so it was really, really an amazing hub. And it's kind of like, I often use the term business broccoli. I was force feeding game developers who want to talk about tech and design and sort of the junk food. And I was force feeding them their business broccoli to be strong and healthy, entrepreneurs. And I think it really had a dramatic impact on the viability, sustainability of those studios. within a 5-year span, the survival rate of startups within the space was like 90%, which is unheard of, for just sort of normal startup stats.
That's incredible. That's
Yeah. And within that 5-year span, because we had to report back to the government because we were taking some government grants and stuff, year over year, by the end of 5 years, if you counted up all the game sales, revenue, funding, publishing deals, whatever, CMF from all the studios, we were like well past 300 million, which is not insignificant for a little like indie, startup hub. Sadly, of course, with COVID, you can't exactly sustain a co-working space during a global lockdown.
Another casualty of COVID. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's fast forward well past COVID. We've had some preview chats with you about all the things that are going on globally. And this pod and a lot of our work has been very North American focused. So bring us news from abroad. What is happening out there? And tell us about what being an ecosystem strategist is and what ecosystems you're working in that you're excited about.
I'm very, very fortunate that I get to travel the world and kind of see game industry, game communities, game ecosystems, from literally the four corners of the globe. Earlier this year, I was down in Brazil. A lot of exciting stuff happening in Brazil. Last year in South Africa, did a bunch of work in New Zealand, which I think is a thriving ecosystem, even given the current industry climate. Next month, I go to Gamescom in Germany, but then from Gamescom, fly down to Saudi Arabia. I've been doing a bit of work in the Middle East over the past couple of years. Did some funding scheme rewriting in Switzerland, also Asia. We just did a big mandate in Malaysia. So the Malaysian government has been supporting games for over a decade. And the impact of their interventions, they felt, were not as high or great as they were hoping for. And so they wanted someone to kind of audit their programs and kind of see maybe where some tweaks were possible, or what directions could be improved.
This focus on New Zealand, you've mentioned that a couple times about it being like set up for success. What's New Zealand doing right? What are the lessons learned from New Zealand?
I mean, New Zealand's in the middle of nowhere, like literally in the middle of nowhere. And they kind of have we're just got to do it ourselves because everyone else is too far. And so one of the things that they're particularly good at, one is working on their own IP, so their own games. They're much less doing kind of co-development or working on licensed IP, this kind of stuff. So most of the games they do, it's all their own games. So they're all making original IP, which is sort of a key ingredient to creating value long term for a studio, as opposed to doing working on with Disney on Mickey Mouse games and then you own nothing and nobody even knows who you are. Similarly, again, because they're so far away and don't necessarily always get the chance to go to GDC or Gamescom or whatever to pitch, to get publishing deals, etc., most of them kind of just say, well, we'll just self-publish. We'll do it ourselves. And so there's more knowledge there about how to build community, how to do your marketing, how to get a recognition, discoverability for your game. And so in addition to building and owning their own IP, they're also cultivating and owning their audiences, their fan bases. Which I think actually for long-term sustainability of a studio, the most important asset is your fan base. If you can capture them, delight them, make them fall in love with you, et cetera, that really creates long-term value. And so kind of the nature of their isolation in many ways has kind of forced them to make their own games, to self-publish them and build their audiences. And then the governmental support structures have been built in such a way to facilitate that, to enable that. They have something called CODE, which is the Center of Digital Excellence, New Zealand CODE. They fund prototypes and early stage development, but then they're hardcore running workshops on marketing and community building and Steam and all how all these things work. And then you have actually something we helped design was a rebate program where, as a game developer in New Zealand, you can claim up to 20% of all your development and marketing expenses for game making. In part, that's a response to all the tax credits and so on that exist around the world. And Australia had recently instituted a tax credit, and so New Zealand kind of felt they had to respond to sort of maintain a degree of competitiveness. But interestingly, and this is one of my direct contributions, originally it was just going to be development costs. And then I said, hey, but your industry is already self-publishing. Like, you don't want them to stop that and devalue it. If you're saying, well, if you do dev work, you get 20% off, but if you do marketing and business work, well, that's full price.
No,
Then
well,
people all of a sudden, they're like, everyone now is a game programmer design. Like, I said, you don't want to like unbalance that. So I said, you have to count marketing, community, all that kind of stuff as part of the rebate, part of the 20%.
that might drive people to becoming outsourcers, basically, right? And stop.
Yeah, outsourcers or look to publishers. And then if you're looking to publishers, so if it was dev only, then I'm going to like maximize my dev expenditure, offload the marketing to the publisher. But now what happens is I'm ruining my long-term sustainability, because the eyeballs, the fans kind of go to the publisher, because I'm only doing the dev now, and they're doing the marketing and talking to the Twitch streamers and, you know, building the channels and all that kind of stuff.
Jason, on the subject of audiences, we spoke earlier, and you made this really interesting observation. You've done work in Africa and South Africa and Nigeria about African developers, how they think about audience, and how there's a little bit of a paradox, or at least a surprising turn there.
I'm only just starting to explore the African continent. I've been down to South Africa several times, Morocco. I've done some mentoring work with studios in Kenya and Nigeria and stuff like that. So I would not claim to be like a hardcore expert, but I'm starting to help where I can. But often, from what I've seen, is that the studios assume that they have to start making games just for their local audience. You know, fine. Obviously, there's a cultural touch point, reference, style, visual, whatever, resonance, and so on. But also in these regions, like, the monetization is not very high. So while the players may be there, or they might be sort of on mobile, relatively, less expensive or less capable devices on average, it means from a business opportunity point of view, it's like not as exciting. And it's hard to kind of graduate when you're sort of just scraping by. Just the monetization is quite hard. Never mind that mobile in general as a platform these days is much harder to penetrate as a startup, because of the immense user acquisition costs required. And so even though there's sort of this instinct, we'll make games for our brothers and sisters, right around us, I think it's kind of it's hard to actually achieve success. Whereas if they said, okay, well, let's actually make games for, a global audience, I'm not suggesting that's a trivial amount of effort, but it's not that much more effort than the effort to make a game, for any audience, to just make it for a global audience. And so I think there's greater opportunity to sort of be global from the start. I mean, the same way, if you look at Finland, right? Finland game developers did not say, let's make some mobile games for other Finns and do it in Finnish and whatever, and then we'll see if we can like succeed there, and then go. It's like, there's 5 million Finns. Same thing with New Zealand. New Zealand is 5 or 6 million people. They didn't say, well, let's make some games about, rugby or whatever, and then we'll see if and then we'll go. They're like, oh, well, we have no choice. We're going to go global. And so from a continental point of view, the African market from a head count is, it's large. Big. And so it's enticing to think, oh, I just capture that market and then I'll have baseline success and then, scale. And it hasn't really proven to be the case.
If you think about something like Minecraft, obviously, which is now, a multi-billion-dollar franchise, but it started off 3 guys with this very, very strong Swedish sensibility, but a universal experience that anybody could understand and play. And so it had this Swedish identity, but it had global applications, which we've seen. And I think that this is the kind of combination. You don't want to localize so much that you're shrinking your market, which I think that's the lesson here.
Listen, a lot more research is required, and I'm only kind of going anecdotally off of some of the my own more limited experiences, but it's kind of something that I've been seeing.
So you said you're on your way shortly to the Middle East, and that's an interesting spot, very different from New Zealand or Africa in that there's a lot of money, right? And they really are trying to change the nature of their economy that's been long been an extractive economy in that area. And they're trying to say, let's build a different economy. And they're making giant bets. And I think the jury's out on like the city of the future and that they're investing in. But what are you seeing there?
I really like going to the Middle East. It's one of my favorite, foods. I eat way too much when I'm over there. Anywhere, I just love the food, and the people are so nice. I mean, everyone is so nice and so warm, and the passion for games and game making, I mean, it's tangible, it's palpable. Everyone really is so driven, and so it's very exciting to be there on the ground, talking with game industry people and students and game developers and stuff like that. So kind of at a very on the ground level, there's just such a great energy and excitement for the potential of games. Now, certain countries in the region have much more resources than others. Of course, Saudi Arabia being one of the richer, if not the richest in the region, and they've made some big bets and big promises to diversify their economies. What they call sort of Vision 2030, and they see games and media entertainment as a sort of a vector for some of that change. I've been to Saudi Arabia once before, about 2 years ago, and it's exciting. It's exciting to see what's going on, and again, the passion with the people and the developers that you meet there. Are their interventions having the greatest impact possible? Are they solving the puzzles in the sort of the order that I would solve it? Not necessarily, and I think there's definitely room there to optimize. And I'll give you kind of an illustrative example where consultant X says, "Oh, incubators are the thing. Yeah. You should go build some incubators in Saudi Arabia." And all of a sudden you'll get all these startups and stuff will happen. Go build. And so then someone in the government said, "All right, it's incubators, everyone," and they built 100 of them, or not 100, like a dozen of them. There was no one to join the incubator. Like the pipeline of talent, the step before the incubator didn't exist, and no one told them to build that. And so they built all these incubators, and at most there was 10 teams, and there was nothing else on the bench. And so those 10 teams joined the first incubator, and they kind of got some support. And then there was no one else to join the other. So let's go join the next one. And so they just basically circulated amongst the incubation programs, and there was never anyone else on the bench to come next. And so this is where they have almost unlimited resources, and yet someone told them, "Oh, incubator is the answer," and they kind of did that, and they're like, "Well, how come things aren't really?" Well, okay, well, you have to inspire the entrepreneur. You have to get education at the school level, with these pipelines, like all these other pieces to then feed, so you have this constant flow. And then also what comes after the incubator. Okay, fine, someone built something cool, but if there's not the next thing for them to graduate to move, then well, they get in line to the next one, and it just sort of you get these spinning wheels.
Just I went through an accelerator program here in San Francisco, Alchemist Accelerator, and the number of people who came from a previous accelerator into that accelerator, or whose goal was to get to the next accelerator, was we're going to go to Y Combinator next. So there are people who make their living just going from accelerator to accelerator, which is it's not the point.
It's a lifestyle choice. It's a lifestyle play. It's always interesting how very well-resourced institutions, organizations, et cetera, sometimes it's a paradox, is that the unlimited resources create limiting factors in a funny way. And lack of planning or lack of proper sequencing, which is, I think, what you're talking about, and putting in place a longer term plan that can create a virtuous cycle is one of the kind of problems, because you can just build the incubator and you don't have to do all of the work, leading up to it. You think about what you did in Montreal. All the work that was done for a decade or more before you did it was what made it successful.
This is kind of what I made it up, but ecosystem strategist is thinking in that more holistic kind of dependencies. What are all the different pieces? Because even I'll get a call from a government. They'll say, "Hey, you're the incubator guy. Come build us an incubator." I'm like, maybe.
Yeah. Right. Yes. Right.
Okay. Right. Hold on. What's here? What's feeding this?
Yeah.
Where are all the different pieces? And then it almost always sort of explodes to a much more holistic plan. Or also, "Oh, you're the guy from Canada. Help us figure out the tax break thing. We want a tax break." Tax break is a very specific tool to use. And if you don't have companies that are already wrestling with labor costs, then having a tax break to minimize labor costs is irrelevant, right? So, we also did some work in Bahrain. Bahrain really had no industry to speak of, and they had identified, let's see if games is a thing we can kind of build up. They had half a studio. They had a part-time studio, no school, no talent pipe. They were really starting from scratch. And so their first instinct was well, we looked around and it seemed like, Canada has a tax break and other cool places UK, like let design us a tax break. And then we're like, no, we're not going to do that. Like, it's the wrong answer. Like, if we take a tax break and put it in the middle of the desert, like literally in the middle of the desert, like nothing will happen because you don't even have the companies to. So it became a much larger, more holistic mandate of like putting all the pieces into place and all creating all those dependencies. Okay, a tax break, we'll worry about that in year 7. We got all this other stuff to do that comes before it.
Well, this is a much sexier interview than we even anticipated. There was espionage and ecosystem strategist. I mean, this is exotic stuff. So there's a new thing that you have announced, a new vector for your important work in the industry, working with Griffin Gaming Partners, right? So tell us about that. That's, I think, the largest VC in the world that's dedicated exclusively to the games industry.
Griffin's been around for a few years. I think they started was 2018, 17, 18 or so. They are the largest kind of game industry focused venture fund. Their assets under management are over $1 billion. Makers Fund is not far behind. I think with 800 or 900 million. You have Andreessen Horowitz with their A16Z game fund and Speedrun, which is probably 600 million or so. They're a large entity. They're invested in things like Discord and some other massive cornerstones of the industry. And so I came on board as a venture partner. And a venture partner is kind of just a sexy way of saying a scout. So basically, they have a handful of venture partners that they trust, that they believe have the right kind of taste, finger on the pulse, and sees stuff that they wouldn't normally see in an average day. So the fact that I'm, 1 week I'm in Brazil, the next I'm in New Zealand, then I'm over in South Africa, then I'm, Malay, it gives them kind of visibility that they wouldn't normally have. And as a venture partner, really what you're doing is you're bringing them the best opportunities. So if I go on a trip to New Zealand and I meet, Studio X, and I'm like, oh wow, this is like amazing. Okay, I think this is a real opportunity. Let me bring you back to my friends at Griffin. So it gives me like a direct path to the people writing the checks, as opposed to if you were just sort of startup person and you have to like work your way up and knock on all the doors and get through all the hurdles and pass all the gates and all that kind of stuff. I basically just take you to the person who writes it doesn't mean they'll say yes.
Right.
But if
you can shorten the courtship process.
Yeah, exactly. And I only get rewarded like 5 years down the road. If the business scales, exits, and the payday, then I get a little slice, of that future value. So I'm incentivized, but I'm not on the payroll. Like I kind of go around the world. I still do all the stuff that I do. I still do work all my workshops and advising studios and working with governments, all that kind of stuff.
Even more than normal, you have to see into the future to be an effective scout here, don't you? Yeah.
Well, exactly.
So we often ask, and you can't say Pong, but is there a game that you've played recently or a game that you've seen recently that you've fallen in love with?
It would be funny if I said Pong, like, oh yeah, I'm playing Pong.
If you said Pong, we would be worried. Yes.
Yes, exactly. I have not graduated. Yes, I mean, I play a bunch of stuff that's sort of in development under wraps, et cetera, et cetera. So for work reasons, I'm playing a bunch of things that obviously I can't talk about. I'm still trying to finish Assassin's Creed Shadows. That's the one I'm currently actively playing, and I'm over 100 hours in, which is scary. But are
you having fun?
Oh yeah. It's interesting because I'm a completionist. So if I play something I like 100% all achievement, like everything. And so I really only play like one game at a time. But I played the original Assassin's Creed. Over a decade ago, much more than a decade, I forget the year it came out, but because I was like mesmerized by it, we actually had Patrice Desilets and Jade Raymond, the original creative director and producer, were at an IGDA Montreal chapter event where they got on stage and said, "Hey, everybody, here's our new Ubisoft project." Everyone was just blown away. And as soon as that game came out, I bought it. I played it 100%, found all the flags and whatever, and then I never played any other Assassin's Creed since then.
Right.
Like, I got the experience, and it was long. I enjoyed it, but I don't need to do all that. But now in Greece and now in whatever, like I did it, and so only now with Shadows did I say, oh, you know what? I really, well, you can see my sword there.
Yeah.
I really like feudal Japan, samurais, ninja, all that stuff. Like I really, really enjoy all that. I said, oh, you know what? Maybe it's time I do another Assassin's Creed. So I had not played any of them since the original, but this one, and it's a credit to Ubisoft. You know, they've had some up and down years. It is a beautiful game, a really enjoyable game, and kudos to them.
Thank you for that, Jason. And thank you for being here and really sharing these stories. It's been fascinating for us. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Anytime, anytime, guys.